Hello, and welcome to Mayor Brown's webinar, Post-Election Analysis, Consequences for Global Trade. My name is Warren Payne, and I'm a Senior Advisor at Mayor Brown in Government Affairs, Global Trade, and Tax Practice Groups. Joining me today are, as co-presenters, our Ambassadors Mickey Cantor and Susan Schwab, former U.S. trade representatives and current partner and strategic advisor, respectively, at Mayor Brown. As well as Tim Keeler, former Chief of Staff at the U.S. Trade Representative and current partner at Mayor Brown. Before we kick off our panel, let me get a few housekeeping items out of the way. First, please note that when accessing the webinar, you'll probably get better reception and less disruption to the video feed if you are operating outside of a Citrix environment. The program is being streamed through your computer, so please ensure your volume or your headphones are turned up to ensure best audio quality. Today's webinar is also being recorded. If you have any questions that are unanswered during the presentation, we invite you to submit them via the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. We will do our best to address questions live or after today's session. If you are watching the recording of this webinar, feel free to email the panelists using the emails shown in front of you on the screen. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. I'll turn first to Ambassador Mickey Cantor to provide his thoughts on the overall themes and approach to the development and implementation of trade policy in the forthcoming Biden administration. Mickey?
Thanks very much, Warren, and good morning, Tim and Susan. Let me start by saying, which would be an overall theme in terms of what we're talking about this morning, we're talking about the first 6 months of the Biden administration. It's very hard to predict beyond that, but we know in the first 6 months, domestic policy will rule the roost. It will be the most important. Everything from COVID-19 to the stimulus bill to an infrastructure bill. And so as we look at trade in the first 6 months, trade will be a supportive item in this situation, not the lead. When I came in as USTR, obviously we had the NAFTA and WTO and APEC all on the agenda. My agenda was set and it established my priorities a long time ago, of course. Now, of course, we've got to look at the domestic agenda and let me add to that, confirming the nominees in addition to COVID-19, stimulus bill, infrastructure, et cetera. So let's talk about trade. Trade is a supportive item, and trade, as we're going to take a look at it in this seminar. What we're going to find with trade is that the U.S. will try to rebuild relations with Europe, both as an economic matter and as a geopolitical matter. But in rebuilding relationships with Europe, we got a very difficult agenda. With the EU, we have the Boeing and Google situations with very heavy fines, aluminum and steel tariffs, and whether or not they should be removed or not. What we do at the WTO and the appellate body, and then, but also in supporting the WTO and re-entering other organizations which will help Europe, like the World Health Organization, the Paris Accords, what we do with the nuclear arrangement with Iran, and how we deal with China. As you know, Europe has a little different approach to dealing with China than we do, but it must be dealt with. The RCEP, the new trade agreement that the ASEAN's initiated, but China has taken over basically in Asia, has really, without the U.S. Involved, has really much bigger than TPP and much more current. So the new administration is going to have to deal with that and deal with that in a very quickly. In dealing with that, of course, it means we're going to have to rebuild confidence in Korea and Japan, Australia and New Zealand, the ASEANs in order to build an alliance that can deal with China, not only, of course, on the issue of the RCEP, but other issues as well. That confidence is not there right now among our allies. That has been lost over the last 4 years and is going to have to be reestablished. There are other big issues, of course, that we're going to have to address as well at some point. Trade Promotion Authority is going to be an issue. The issues of climate and labor issues and trade agreements, a potential UK free trade agreement, Buy America provisions, and trying to protect America's workers. As we look at those things, like every administration that comes in, there'll be a lot of, let's say, contradictory ways in which the administration may move. And let me say this, the problem that a Democratic administration will face is that the Democratic Party is split on trade, with probably a majority of Democrats who are not pro-trade, not pro-trade as trade advocates would establish it, and therefore will make it difficult for the administration to make moves on the trade issues, as I said, certainly in the first 6 months, but after that. In the first 6 months, the administration will not take any initiatives in terms of trade, which will get in the way of their domestic agenda. And I think that's a theme we ought to keep coming back to. Warren?
Thank you, Mickey, for that overview and introduction. At this point, I'm going to turn to Tim Keeler, who will walk through some of the key issues related to the transition between Trump and the Biden administration, a process that has already begun with the announcement of the Biden transition team members to such agencies as USTR and the Department of Commerce. Tim?
Thanks, Warren. Obviously, we have an unusual situation with the, a transition team being named by the Vice President and no concession yet from President Trump. So, it's not like, I think it's a fair assumption that there isn't a transition meetings going on between the Trump administration and the incoming Biden administration. That being said, for the U.S. Trade Representative transition, I don't think this is that big of a deal, at least not right now. The folks that were named to the Biden transition team, a number of them have significant experience in trade issues, including in USTR. So there isn't a dearth of knowledge on that side. USTR, is an agency that, in general, what it does from a big picture perspective is out in the open and public. So I don't think there's any, classified information or information taking that won't be, public by the time, of next year comes around. If you read, the trade press here and in certain other countries, you can pretty much know what's going on in the trade world at any given time. I suspect at some point there will, those types of meetings and coffees between the personnel will happen. The only thing that is really not that public is internal budget numbers. And as far as agencies go, the budget is probably the least important aspect of USDR. Having been responsible for it, I could say that. USDR is not an agency with an R&D program. I mean, it's essentially salaries and office furniture for the most. So it's really what's happening right now isn't a situation for the United States at all. What is happening is public as well, I think, and that's an important aspect of the transition team will have to work on is making recommendations about what to do with respect to the negotiations with the UK, as Mickey Cantor mentioned, what to do with respect to the Boeing Airbus fight, which is, a decades old fight at this point with actual retaliation on both sides, either in place now or, in fact, it is in place on both sides of the Atlantic. And, it's possible that both sides are still talking to each other. What to do about digital service taxes, and what to do about the China 301 tariffs. Many exemptions from which, for particular products, including COVID-related products, are expiring December 31st. So, it's a lot of issues that are like that a transition team can prepare on, can make recommendations for. The traditionally, I think a transition team wouldn't be making necessarily personnel recommendations for who might be certainly at the USTR cabinet level. That'd be handled at a much higher level. It's also typically the case that a USTR, other than a Mickey Cantor, isn't confirmed in the first 24 hours of a new administration. So there's typically a lag. They at some point will name what have been called landing teams in the past, where you have a handful of temporary political appointees who do show up on noon on January 20th to essentially start manning the agency. And the most senior non-Senate confirmed position at USTR is the general counsel. Unusual for a cabinet agency that position is not Senate confirmed, but in the past we've seen people who've been on those landing teams migrate into that position if they don't end up becoming deputy USTRs, which is usually the case. Is the folks on the landing teams are not the ones who end up being in the senior Senate confirmed positions. So I think that gives an overview of what they'll be recommending within the USTR space. By all accounts, not much immediate action on China is what at least what a lot of Biden folks have been telegraphing. The commerce-related actions are, I think, probably going to be under a bigger debate with respect to what to do. Make the steel and aluminum Section 232 tariffs, where USTR negotiated country-related exclusions from those tariffs. So that will be something, I think, that will, on the commerce side of the House, be debated about what to do. So with that, let me turn it back over to you, Warren.
Thank you, Tim. And as Tim and Mickey both highlighted, the U.S.-China relationship is likely the most significant of the trade issues the new Biden administration is going to have to confront. And that is a complex relationship, and it covers and addresses a number of different issues. So I thought what we do is we do a round robin with our panelists on what some of those key issues are. And I thought I would start with Mickey on the issue of IP protection and IP theft as it relates to the U.S.-China relationship. So, Mickey?
Well, first of all, the first item that has to be dealt with is to rebuild our alliances in Asia and trust in those alliances in order to move forward with a common agenda regarding China. Without that, we're not going to get a lot done. And I think that can be done, but it's going to take some work. As I said before, the RCEP, led by China now, has been joined by our allies in Asia. But I think they're looking to us to potentially either put together a new agreement in Asia or to rejoin the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in order to, let's say, have a rival agreement in Asia. But without that, you're not going to reach IP protection. Now, could we do it bilaterally with China? Yes, but only after we begin to open up with China on issues where we have really walked away from the Chinese relationship. America America First, frankly, had become America Alone, as a lot of people have said. And that has certainly cooled our relationship with China. Not to say it wouldn't have been cooled as on because of China's actions. We have a lot to do with China. IP is only one of them.
Thank you, Mickey. Susan, I want to turn to you next. One of the things Tim mentioned were the 301 tariffs, including the question around exclusions. And what is get your sense and your reaction to how the 301 investigation and those tariffs fit into kind of a forthcoming U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I think I would agree with both what Mickey and Tim said and implied, which is I wouldn't hold my breath for dramatic changes on the trade scene in particular between U.S. and China. A lot of the concerns articulated by the Trump administration about U.S.-China trade are concerns that have been articulated by many Democrats, and U.S.-China trade concerns at this point tend to be pretty bipartisan. So the question is, how does that get handled? And we're in an interesting situation right now where just about everybody, and not just U.S. and China, but right now we're focused on U.S. and China, just about everybody's probably in violation of their WTO commitments in terms of where they are. But with the U.S. and China, whereas before the, quote, trade wars started, say January 2018, the average Chinese tariff on U.S. exports was 8%. Average U.S. tariff on Chinese exports to the United States, 3%. Today, that is now after phase one on $360 billion worth of Chinese exports to the United States. We have much higher tariffs, and the average is closer to 19%. And in the case of U.S. exports to China, on the order of $110 billion worth of product hit by tariffs and a lot of non-tariff barriers. You're talking about 20% tariffs on average. I don't see those going away anytime soon under the Biden administration. And you may see, as Tim mentioned, more exclusions. You may see more negotiations. I see let's say, a quieter trade policy. As one trade commentator said, perhaps a more boring trade policy. But I don't necessarily see a whole lot of tariffs being peeled back anytime soon, because we don't see a phase two on the horizon. And a lot of the fundamental structural problems identified by the Trump administration, and quite frankly, some of them toward the end of the Obama administration. If you take a look, for example, at then Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker's I believe it was one of her last speeches, where she was talking about the risks to the U.S. semiconductor industry from Chinese industrial policy. A lot of those concerns are shared. So again, I wouldn't hold my breath, and I see that continuing. Now, I do believe that we would see a step up in working with U.S. allies who share a lot of concerns that the U.S. has in terms of Chinese trade and industrial policies. They are suffering from the overcapacity issues, the intellectual property theft issues, the forced technology transfer issues. On the other hand, a lot of U.S. allies, and let's face it, the United States, U.S. Manufacturers, service providers, farmers, make money selling to China. China is indeed the largest export market for a lot of these groups. And that also explains some of the difficulties that the U.S. has had, including the Trump administration, trying to get consensus among allies on dealing with some of these issues. And that's not going to go away under the Biden administration.
Thank you, Susan. I would note both you and Tim commented on the impact of the 301 tariffs. And, one of the things that may be staring at a Biden administration on day one is the expiration of quite a few current exclusions, 301 tariffs, as Tim noted, many of which cover medical or COVID-related responses. Ambassador Lighthizer has testified before Congress that it's his view that those exclusions be permitted to expire at the end of the year. And so we may have a short period of time where those exclusions have expired, and the Biden administration is going to have to make a relatively rapid decision on which or how many of those to restore. Another thing Ambassador Schwab talked about was the phase one deal and the fact that there are a lot of American companies and workers whose livelihood depend on exports to China. And so that's a great way to tee up a little bit of discussion of that phase one deal, which involved some commitments by China to make certain amount of purchases of U.S. produced product. Tim, kind of where do you think that stands, and how do you think a Biden administration is going to pick up that phase one agreement, particularly the purchase agreements, and where they might go with that?
Sure, thanks. And I think, the phase one deal is a great example of, you can look at if one potential pathway is boring trade policy, you can look at phase one in one way, and we can also talk about, well, what if it's not boring? Because trade policy by definition is made by two parties, two countries, not by just one. On the boring theory, phase one has a number of purchase commitments spread across a number of manufacturing and agriculture and energy sectors. There's a lot of interesting trackers out there as to what kind of pace the Chinese are on and whether they're going to hit their targets. But by the terms of the agreement, they don't actually have to meet the targets until December 31 of 2021. So, excuse me. On the boring theory, if nobody just talks to each other and those agreements are viewed as continued validity, a Biden administration and China doesn't really have to face a day of decisions or answers until the end of 2021, at which point, the terms will have been met, and there isn't necessarily reasons for change in the underlying dynamics, or they haven't been met, and the Biden administration has to react to the fact they haven't been met. Thus far, I think the Chinese purchase commitments are more on track on the agricultural side than on manufacturing and energy, which makes it difficult to say they're out of compliance completely, because we haven't hit the deadline, and they're in compliance on some politically sensitive sectors of the U.S. economy. The non-boring, let's assume China isn't static for 2021. You could see a lot of possibilities happening where the Chinese essentially say, we no longer view these commitments as valid, or because of COVID or other reasons, or a new administration, we think these tariffs are actually unjust and we don't agree to them anymore, or we are going to up the ante. The Chinese may view themselves as having more leverage. They may start to openly restrict U.S. exports in other ways, in which case that might force a Biden administration to react. So my guess is trade policy is more likely to not be boring, just because we still have tariffs right now on more than $350 billion worth of Chinese exports to the U.S. I would be very surprised if the Chinese didn't make some move to try to squeeze the Biden administration into changing what has actually been somewhat stable for the past 6 months or so.
Thank you, Tim. A number of the issues we have talked about so far are not just U.S. concerns, as Susan noted, but they're concerns shared by a number of our trading partners and allied countries. Mickey has used the phrase rebuilding trust with our allies. The Biden campaign has emphasized that a Biden administration would focus more on multilateralism, so a synonym for rebuilding trust, perhaps. There are a number of issues that multilateralism or an approach of multilateralism to the issue could change the way the U.S. trade policy is focused. While we stick with the China theme for just another minute, and Mickey, kind of give us your thoughts on how a Biden administration's emphasis on multilateralism changes the posture and potentially the trajectory of U.S.-China relations, and particularly with respect to trade policy.
Thank you, Warren. It will, and here's the U.S. will try to walk and chew gum at the same time. In walking, they will reach out to Europe and try to the EU and try to work out some of the problems that we have right now. I referred to some of them earlier, but I think that is a critical item for the U.S. And it's critical in terms of even dealing with China, because our approach to China and Europe's approach to China are not exactly the same, and they're going to have to be consistent and coordinated if we're going to make progress. But in the meantime, let me make it clear what I think. This administration will talk very tough with China over the first at least 6 months, if not longer, on things like labor rights in China or militarization of the islands on the South China Sea, or of course any number of trade issues that we know we have with China. And so as that goes on, the U.S. will be trying to work with the Congress to get the domestic priorities approved. As I mentioned those before, certainly the stimulus bill and the an infrastructure bill and any issues that need to be addressed by the Congress with COVID-19. And so you're going to find the administration weighing heavily on looking tough, solidifying support with their allies in Congress, and building support with their allies outside of in Europe and in Asia. And it seems to me that's where this administration is going to go in the first 6 months.
Warren, if I could interject here, two call it contextual issues. One, we probably should factor into account a big unknown here, which is what actions does the Trump administration take, does Bob Lighthizer take between now and January 20 in the trade arena that we haven't thought of yet? One example may be associated with COVID-related items and the Buy America side. But I mean, for example, so there are any number of things that could happen between now and January 20th. As we all know, there are a number of statutes that expire also at the end of 2020. So that's one set of issues. There are also potential trade agreements or partial trade agreements that could be reached before January 20. We may be talking about that later. But the other thing, item of context, I think worth considering, apropos of what Mickey just said, whereas one could argue that trade policy has in many ways, or trade issues have in many ways been dominant in the Trump administration's foreign policy, for a Biden administration, we're more likely to see foreign policy, and that includes trying to bring allies together, foreign policy have a more highlighted role, and that influencing trade policy. Now, if you're talking about the Paris Climate Accord, or you're talking about addressing North Korean nukes or Iran nuclear issues, what are the trade implications of that? And U.S. China, U.S. Europe, and so on, because there will be some controversy associated with any perception that if the Biden administration takes a softer line on trade vis-a-vis, say, China or even Europe on controversial trade issues, if it is being sacrificed for, quote, higher foreign policy objectives.
It's a great observation, Susan. Let's stick with that, what I think is a implicit theme there that gets to the multilateralism question. And that is, as you have perhaps a more multilateral viewpoint in your trade policy, you bring more actors to the table and you bring more issues to the table at the time. So, to a certain extent, kind of the multilateralism or multilateral style approach, you end up with more balls in the air at one time. So from your perspective, thinking about back to your time when you were the USTR and it was your responsibility to negotiate, how does that approach potentially complicate, how a Biden administration deals with our allies? As Mickey noted, there's a number of other issues, tariff issues out there, trade irritants, WTO cases out there. And then the other side of the coin is, do they give a Biden administration more tools in the toolbox? So kind of what, based on your experience, how does that balance out looking forward?
Well, it is a great question. And one of the things we haven't talked about here is personalities really do count, right? I mean, who ends up as USTR? Who ends up as Secretary of Commerce? Who ends up as Secretary of State? NSC, NEC, those are really important. Personalities count. In our case, I must say, and maybe Tim will remember this differently, in our case, we had a pretty clear field. And we did a lot of consultations with the interagency process. I was constantly interacting with Condi Rice at the State Department and with Hank Paulson at Treasury, with Carlos Gutierrez, with the Secretary of Agriculture. So we had a lot of interagency conversations going on. Steve Hadley at the NSC. However, at the end of the day, it was very clear that the president wanted the USTR and wanted U.S. trade policy to be made on its own merits. And so, for example, if we felt it was time to take a case against China to the WTO, we would go through the interagency process. And in my conversations with Steve Hadley, the conversation might be along the following lines. Maybe we ought to wait a week or accelerate a week because of something going on in terms of high foreign policy, right, associated with North Korea or associated with some other interaction we were having with the Chinese. But no one ever would say, don't take the case. So we had there was a lot of support from the White House and from the other agencies for the trade, for an aggressive, proactive trade portfolio. But that differs from administration to administration.
Thank you, Susan. That's really interesting context. One of the things that gets to this question of trade policy being made on its own merits that a Biden administration is going to have to confront is, for some issues at least, there's this kind of growing confluence of different policy issues coming together. And one that jumps out to me is what has already happened in the confluence of international tax policy and international trade policy, and one that the Biden administration is going to have no choice but to have to deal with early on in the first 6 months, which is the time we've been talking about here. And Tim noted kind of the proliferation of DSTs, digital services taxes. There is obviously ongoing OECD-based negotiations to try to reach a multilateral, multi-country consensus on how to deal with these issues, with these taxing issues. It has been the position of the Trump administration that they don't really like the unilateral DSTs. They have taken to using trade policy, specifically the Section 301 investigations and the threat of tariffs, as a tool in those negotiations. A Biden administration is going to have to confront that issue, particularly if the OECD negotiations don't come to a conclusion, don't come to a robust conclusion by the current goal of mid-2021. And I think people may, and you read some of this in the tax press, I think some people, some stakeholders may overstate how a change in administration will change the U.S. view to these and the potential use of trade policy in this space. If you look carefully at the comments that have come out of Congress on a bipartisan basis, including from Senator Ron Wyden, who is the lead Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, the committee with jurisdiction over trade, from Leader Chuck Schumer of New York, who's the leader of the Democrats, from Richie Neal, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which is the committee with jurisdiction over tax and trade policy in the House. All have been very clear that they will not sacrifice the U.S. tax base to either unilateral DSTs or these OECD negotiations. And I think that is going to be these issues where a Biden administration is going to have no choice but to have to confront a complex kind of multi-policy issue that is tax and trade in the first 6 months. And the decision is going to have to be, do they continue using trade policy as a tool, or do they start to find other, perhaps more tax-centric trade policy or tax-centric policies to address it? And I think that's going to be a fascinating thing to watch, because I do think it's going to be one of those things where, as I tell folks all the time, Republicans and Democrats have lots of fundamental differences on tax policy. Where Republicans and Democrats don't disagree is that they think it's their income to tax and they're not going to let somebody else tax it. So that's going to be something they're going to have to confront. What I might do here is we've covered a lot. We focused a lot on China, but there are literally dozens of other trade policy issues the Biden administration have to confront. And what I thought I might do is do a fast kind of lightning speed round robin on a number of them with our panelists, while also making sure we can leave some time at the end to address questions. So with that in mind, let me turn to Mickey. Mickey, you talked about RCEP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And how do you think a Biden administration is going to address this question of FTAs, whether it's RCEP, TPP, a potential US-UK deal, a potential US-Kenya deal, and kind of looking forward on that? Why don't you take that one off?
They're going to be very careful with that. As I said before, I hate to repeat myself, but I think it's true. Very careful in the first 6 months, any FTAs that they might address. However, they're going to have to begin discussions with our allies in Asia over the RCEP and how it affects U.S. and our allies' interests together and towards China. China dominates the RCEP. RCEP, by the way, was begun, as we all know, by the ASEANs, not by China, but China is literally taking it over. And they have it has a very broad reach, but not very in depth. And it's not what I would call a trade agreement that any U.S. administration would want to enter into. So what we've got now is the U.S. trying to bring our allies to a common agenda with regard to Asia and what to do about TPP, and how the U.S., who is not part of TPP right now, either goes back in or doesn't go back in, begins a new trade agreement, or looks at all the various alternatives we might have. We're taking issues as they come up. I am, though, convinced that the U.S. is not going to want to fight in Congress over the first 6 months. As I said, I repeat myself because it's so important, over anything. They're going to use trade to try to support what we're trying to do, whether it's with the situation with China, with our European allies, or with others.
Thanks, Mickey. Tim, Mickey talked about the administration not wanting to distract from its domestic priorities. But as Susan noted, there's a number of trade policies that expire in the first 6 months of 2021, one of which is Trade Promotion Authority. Kind of looking at the context as Mickey's laid it out, looking at the issues that a Biden administration is going to be dealing with, and how do you think TPA authority fits in, if at all? And if TPA authority doesn't fit in, is there potentially a different legislative approach to the context of having trade negotiations and trade agreements that a Biden administration may need to confront?
Sure, thanks. No, I agree with Mickey. I think it's unlikely that a Biden administration would want to spend the kind of political capital to avoid a lapse in TPA. And even if it did, I very much doubt whether they would have the votes in the Congress to get TPA renewed. As Mickey mentioned, traditionally their TPA bills have passed with a minority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans. I think the Democratic caucus probably looks the same on these sorts of trade questions, but I don't think the Republican caucus in either conference or in the House or the Senate is the same as the pre-Trump era. I think there would be a lot of skepticism to TPA generally, and in particular to handing new authority to, or at least having sufficient votes to hand this kind of authority to a President Biden. I will also note, I mean, the TPA is in effect for 6 months. So the Biden administration will have to decide with respect to the negotiations with the United Kingdom, do they want to complete whatever is left for them? I think it's a small chance that the Trump administration makes a frantic effort to initial a deal by January 20th. I think it's more than zero, which I think most observers give it. It is a small chance, which would, create a very crystal clear question for the Biden administration. Whether they, even if they don't do that, they'd have, I think, till the end of March to decide do they want to initial a deal so that they could sign it by TPA deadline. One thing that should be clear is the UK-EU relationship by the time they come into office, and whether that would make a UK deal under a Biden administration feasible or not. That is one variable that will be cleared up. If they did want to do something like join the TPP successor, that it's difficult to see how they could do that without TPA, and it's difficult to see how they could renegotiate certain aspects that might be very, very problematic, like the rules of origin in TPP, which allow a lot of Chinese content, I think, as they're currently constructed. And even if they wanted to renegotiate those new rules of origin, I'm not sure that the existing TPP and its successor members would want to do that, even on a longer timeline, or as opposed to a short one. And I do want to mention one other thing real quickly. Mickey mentioned at the beginning the issues with respect to the EU. I think it'll be a very big challenge for the Biden administration when it comes to the rubber hitting the road. It's one thing to say we want to team up with our allies and then and work with them on what to do with China. It's another thing to translate that into what exactly does that mean. And a fundamental challenge is, I think, most of the U.S. institutional players, including most of the Congress, think that utilizing those tariffs has been a source of leverage that apparently the Biden administration is unlikely to remove right away, even though the U.S. I think lost at the panel stage, although not adopted, as to whether those tariffs were WTO inconsistent. And I think the EU has been of the view that those tariffs were inconsistent with U.S. WTO obligations, and that the EU fundamentally places the WTO system ahead of prioritizing that over what to do about China. So on the things that Mickey listed about what the irritants in the U.S.-EU relationship, the WTO appellate body, steel tariffs, Boeing Airbus tariffs and negotiations, digital services taxes, and perhaps you can throw the WTO Director General position in there as well. Even if the U.S. were to accede to the EU position on all five of those questions, where does the EU do in return? I don't see the EU imposing tariffs on China jointly with the U.S. I suspect their position will continue to be, we'd love to bring WTO cases against China, or we'll seek to negotiate the rules changes at the WTO, which would require China's assent. So it's not clear to me how much the EU has to give to a Biden administration, or is willing to give. That'll be a very difficult situation and negotiation with the EU. I think people have assumed that not having mean tweets will make it a lot easier. I don't think that's the case.
Thanks, Tim. Let me go to Susan here to see what additional thoughts she might have on a couple of those topics, particularly, how a Biden administration might deal with a U.S.-UK almost baked agreement, a U.S.-Kenya partially baked agreement. And then, as Tim said, kind of your experience dealing with the EU and other countries, whether it's Japan or South Korea, or two countries we really haven't talked about much here, and they're big trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and USMCA implementation. There are these issues that are going to be pending for a Biden administration. Make sure, Susan, we get your thoughts on some of these.
Well, let me start by agreeing with Tim that in our experience and in the Obama administration's experience, and obviously in the Trump administration's experience, U.S.-EU trade is not an easy task. And while I don't think if you'd had a Biden administration in place, or certainly not a Bush administration, you wouldn't have seen 232 being used, such a blunt instrument on steel and aluminum against the EU, against Canada, against Mexico. I don't think that would have been used. I think a more scalpel-like approach would have been used. On the other hand, the problems that generated it, and this goes back to issues like Chinese overcapacity, remain problems. And as Tim indicated, there are still differences in approach between the U.S. and the EU. And I believe if Bob Lighthizer could have struck a deal with the Japanese and the EU on approaches to overcapacity that they could have taken to the WTO, they would have done so. I'm just speculating here, but that's my guess. And if you look at, for example, what happened to TTIP during the Obama administration, TTIP, the transatlantic trade investment partnership deal, that fell apart because of the EU side, not because of the US side. So, there are some challenges here that I think that perhaps our European colleagues are underestimating. Less so, I think, with respect to Canada and Mexico. I think that is less the case. In part, if you talk to for example, the steelworkers were against the 232. The steelworkers union is a North American steelworkers union. It is Canada and U.S. So that's sort of a different political equation. But the leadership supported President-elect Biden. So that is a factor to take into account here. And from the Biden campaign literature, all of the references to Buy America and melt and pour content of infrastructure, it is clear that those issues associated with trade restrictions aren't going to go away. On the UK Kenya deals, I'm with Tim in that I think there is a shot at a US-UK deal. At least I would hope that somebody in the White House is going to realize TPA expires by July 1, that it's likely to be a while before it gets renewed. And there is a very, very narrow window to try to do a deal with the fifth largest economy in the world. And so whether you look at it from a foreign policy perspective or you look at it from a economic perspective, assuming the UK and the EU have done their deal, and we know what those parameters are, I believe that a US-UK deal is doable, whether it is outlined by the Trump administration. Really, to get something initialed, that can go through April. And then there are flexibilities there before something is signed by the end of June. So I think there's a shot there, and it fits into both the foreign policy and the commercial policy option. Now, it would have to be delivered on the UK side too. So this is not just up to the US. On the Kenya-US deal, I think that's harder. But again, if the Kenyan government is prepared to do a deal, maybe a multiple step deal where initial step or steps are undertaken, I'm a little more doubtful about that, but we'll see.
Thank you, Susan. One of the things you just mentioned was Buy America and infrastructure. And Mickey, you talked about infrastructure as part of the priority, domestic policy priority for the first 6 months of the Biden administration. So, Mickey, do you think things like Buy America, whether applied in response to the COVID pandemic or for steel and aluminum and an infrastructure package, is a Biden approach to the Buy America question really more like one of those areas we don't expect to see a lot of change, will be more like what the Trump administration has pursued, or whether you think there's particular nuances to how a Biden administration might address that? So, Mickey, your thoughts on that?
There may be some nuances. In fact, there probably will be, but I think that the Biden administration will go ahead with a Buy America program. President-elect Biden has been very clear about that, Warren, and so I think that's going to happen. Let me go back to real quickly on the U.S.-UK potential free trade agreement. Given the fact that January 20th, a new administration comes in, given the fact there's going to be a truncated period in which to put a program together, when you have a new Secretary of Treasury, Commerce, State, USTR all trying to come together, I think it's very difficult to get a UK deal negotiated and initialed and get it through the Congress under TPA as it presently exists. On the other hand, I also am very negative whether you get a TPA deal through the Congress itself and create that fight, because the administration is not going to do so, is not going to want to do that. So that's a real problem. Although a UK deal will be less controversial than, say, a Kenya deal, or less controversial than other deals that might come up.
Thank you, Mickey. Kind of one of the, Susan and quite frankly, all of us have talked about this intersection of different issues. One of those big issues that we haven't talked about right now is the intersection between import and export trade and investment. And that kind of brings us to the question of CFIUS. And we've seen, I think, a very expansive growth, both from an executive branch side, but also a legislative branch side. There's been very significant statutory changes to the operation of CFIUS during the Trump administration. Tim, this is an area you spend a lot of time in. How do you think a Biden administration may, or quite frankly, may not make a lot of changes in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting space because I don't think they'll have a lot of room to make changes, and therefore I don't think, and I'm not sure they even want to make changes if they had the room to make it. It'll largely be on autopilot. It'd pretty much be the same, except for probably not having presidential tweets on particular transactions. Prior to the Trump administration, the Obama administration had been starting to block or effectively de facto block Chinese investments in a lot of sensitive areas, particularly semiconductors at the time. The Trump administration came in, Chinese investment as a whole plummeted. There have been, it's not a complete block. There have been some deals, but we're talking on, it went from 100% to zero and up to 5 to 10% of where it had been prior to 2017. And at the same time, Congress enacted a new statute and regulations have been promulgated and implemented that have made CFIUS very, very tough, and particularly for investments from China and Russia and state-owned enterprises generally. And that is both statutory law, that is regulatory law, that is difficult to change. This is an area where the change for a lighter touch. I don't think that will happen. I think this really reflects not only the Congress but the national security apparatus, career staff who had been in favor and pushed a lot of those legislative changes. And I've seen no indication that a Biden administration wouldn't approach these issues in largely the same way that they are now. I mean, I think it's fairly bipartisan concern of the national security risks of Chinese controlling investments with respect to technology, sensitive personal data on Americans, and U.S. critical infrastructure. I don't see that changing much, and I think even a lot of the executive orders that will get promulgated with respect to China, that some of which we're starting to see with respect to U.S. investments in securities and paper of Chinese companies that are linked to the military or Chinese intelligence, and whatever other EOs that are coming out between now and then. I don't think this will be day one, day two, day three types of executive orders that are overturned by a President Biden. And I suspect, somebody like Ron Klain is going to be acutely aware that anytime they do any changes in the U.S.-China relationship, you're probably going to have, press releases from Senators Hawley, Cotton, and Rubio that are going to, be kind of painful. So I think this is probably an area non-trade specific, but part of the broader U.S. relationship where it's you're not going to see changes except perhaps at the margin.
Real quick, Warren, if I might say something very quick. Those executive orders that might go out early on very quickly will not touch the U.S.-China relation. There'll be environment, there'll be education, there'll be healthcare. That's what they're going to concentrate on.
Thank you, Mickey. We have just a few minutes left, and we do have a couple questions in the chat box that I want to try and get to. The first question relates to the recently initiated 301 investigations against Vietnam. I'm going to start, and then obviously others on the panel should chime in. Obviously, as Susan noted, there are things the Trump administration can try and get to conclusion before the end of the Trump administration. And the 301 investigation on Vietnam is certainly one of them. The USTR has announced that they're going to forego a public hearing, which one could interpret to mean they are in a hurry to reach conclusion on that. I think my own personal view is going forward, there are two components to that. One is on currency manipulation, and one is on forestry practices and illegal logging. I presume that the latter of those two is something that no matter what happens, a Biden administration, because as Mickey has noted, wants a heavier emphasis on climate and environmental issues in our trade relationship, is going to be keen to pursue, much as the Obama administration was keen to pursue similar investigations against Peru. Turn to others on the panel to see if they have additional comments or thoughts on the Vietnam 301. Okay, the second part of that question was whether or not we'll see the 4B tranche of 301 tariffs on China go into place. Obviously, there's the Trump administration has done a series of tranches of tariffs on imports from China, covering the vast bulk of trade. The last part of the U.S.-China trade relationship of U.S. imports from China not covered by these tariffs are what's referred to as 4B. I don't necessarily expect the Trump administration to rush that into place because, as Tim has noted, there is the phase one deal with the purchase commitments, and that would certainly disrupt that. One would expect it would disrupt that. And as you know, I think everybody on the panel has talked about, Biden administration is going to first look to try and rebuild relationships with other countries, pursue a more multilateral approach before taking, or perhaps a better way, before changing any action with respect to China. Let me pause there and see if others on the panel want to weigh in on that one.
If nobody else will go, I'm happy to. I think 4B represents breaking the envelope, so to speak. I think President Trump pushed the envelope on how many tariffs could you apply on imports from China before you had essentially massive stock market negative reactions. And it was certainly much more running room than perhaps any of us ever would have expected. I think when they initially started talking about this, it was import tariffs on $30 to $50 billion worth of imports. And people thought that was perhaps somewhat shocking. So I don't see the Trump administration doing that before they go. It hits mostly consumer-facing goods, and for the same reason, it would be very surprising that that threat could be credibly given by a Biden administration. The 301 against Vietnam, look, it's very interesting because it's such a direct linkage of currency manipulation with trade retaliation, and certainly, I mean, I spent 5 years at the Treasury Department before I went to USDR. Under previous administrations, anything related to currency was really strict province of the Treasury Department, and now Commerce Department is treating currency manipulation as a countervailable subsidy, and USDR has an investigation on currency manipulation as an unfair practice with respect to Vietnam. Unclear exactly what a Biden administration will want to do on those fronts. They're certainly important to a Biden and the Democratic constituencies that do like those actions, and so walking away from them would be, or changing it back to the status quo ante would have some negativity to it. So I think that might even go to Susan's earlier point of who's your Treasury Secretary, who's your USDR, and who's your Commerce Secretary. Who's got strongly held views and who's got aligned to the president. That might be the best predictor of where those issues land.
Warren,
Absolutely.
on the 4B tranche, I think that's less an issue for the reasons Tim is talking about. The quote decoupling focus isn't going to be, I don't think, on consumer goods, but more to the extent you're going to see it. You would see it on, if the administration does anything else between now and January 20, I think you see it on the exclusions, as you mentioned, but also conceivably in new areas of further action related to, for example, the Clean Network, Clean Cloud initiatives.
Thank you, Susan. One more question in the chat box and to get to here. Question for all the panelists. Which tariff rollbacks do you think are the most likely in 2021? Tariffs on EU products over Airbus, 232 Japan, Korea, EU, or bringing back India into the GFP, or none of the above? I'll kick it off. I think that if the Trump administration does not reach any kind of mini deal with India between now and the end of its administration, a Biden administration is going to prioritize, again, as everyone's talked about, helping rebuild relationships with allies, helping rebuild relationships with allies that can help it triangulate against China. I think that U.S.-India relationship is going to be important, and I think that's going to be one where there's going to be a higher priority to cement, improve that relationship, and I would presume consistent with India's views so far in the negotiations with the Trump administration, restoration of GSP benefits is going to be critical to them. But that's my own personal view. Let me turn it over to other panelists and see if they want to weigh in or have an opinion.
Let me say just one very quickly. India will be as Warren, you say, very high priority to a Biden administration. Second, whatever the U.S. will use, whatever tariffs with the EU now, whatever negotiation of Boeing and Google, et cetera, in order to try to move that relationship forward, that will be a high priority, as I said before, to put our relationship and our allies back together, to build confidence in our allies, and to then build a common agenda.
Susan or Tim, anything to add? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for participating. This brings the webinar to a conclusion. We hope this was informational and useful to you. And again, as we said at the top of the webinar, if there are questions you subsequently occur to you, feel free to email any or all the panelists. And again, thank you all very much for participating. Have a fine day. Thank you.